was back in the headlines for this week for his attack on Morgan Stanley. The American bank had said that a Labour government under his leadership was more dangerous than a hard Brexit to the UK economy. In return, Mr Corbyn lashed out at the speculators and gamblers who crashed our economy and really didn't create much good blood with a key part of the UK's economy. Martin Wolf, let's begin where this all started, which is obviously Jeremy Corbyn probably doesn't have a lot of experience of the City of London with the financial sector, so it's not really much surprise that he chose this easy opportunity to attack the big banks who still aren't really that liked by many British voters.
Yes, I think there's more to it than that. It's obvious that he dislikes this symbol of capitalism. I mean, he is a proper socialist. We should understand with well outside any of the social democratic consensus we're familiar with. And he's right that I think the very large portion of the population remain deeply suspicious of the banks. And that's not just Labour supporters. It includes quite a lot of people on the right. Business people, small business people, they complain. And the city is seen as remote, greedy, full of a nest of speculators and associated with this disastrous financial crisis. So it fits in with his ideology. It is popular. And this being so, I expect him to continue this battle. They're an absolutely obvious target. And finally, Conservatives don't really want to defend the city because they don't think it's very popular either.
In terms of a political strategy, Miranda Green, it does make quite a lot of sense that at the beginning of this year, Mr Corbyn had this Trumpite relaunch, or that's how it was briefed, that he was going to learn from the Trump playbook, which is really just about getting headlines. It doesn't matter if they're negative or right or wrong, and it's about setting yourself against the few, the elite, the establishment. And that very much has gone all the way through this year, including the general election campaign, where Mr Corbyn did so much better than expected. So in that sense, it does seem to be a sensible political strategy.
Yes, and I don't think there's any sense in which his team or the bulk of the Labour Party, in fact, not just the Corbyn wing of it, would think these were negative headlines from his intervention yesterday. And I think one of the reasons they've gone for it with this very full-throated response on Morgan Stanley is because there is a lot of chatter about why isn't Labour doing better in the polls. When you've got a governing Conservative Party in such a mess, total disarray, terrible troubles over the number one issue of the day, Brexit, ministerial resignations from the cabinet almost weekly. You really, as the opposition party, should be cleaning up in terms of public opinion, but there's still a huge chunk, the detailed polling shows, of people that even though they don't think the government's doing a good job, they are not willing to look at the Corbyn alternative. So it's in their interest to try and garner a few headlines. And as you've said, if the object of their left-wing ire is actually a hate figure that many people also see as suspicious in terms of its role in the wider economy, then it's all to the good.
But Martin Wolf, we sit here as employees of the Financial Times. We generally quite like finance and think that this is a bad idea, that attacking, obviously, the city is a huge revenue generator for the UK. It secures London as one of the financial capitals of the world, and this kind of straightforward populism is not going to help London at such a crucial time when its future is up for grabs, given all the Brexit uncertainties.
I suppose there's a political question, which is, following up from what Miranda said, which is that and I'll come to that in a second, Project Fear, will this Project Fear about what Corbyn will mean, and that's what Morgan Stanley was saying, will it work politically or not? In other words, will the body politic, the very people Miranda's talking about, be frightened by Corbyn's radicalism and say, well, this is all very well, I don't like banks very much, but I really don't want to live in Venezuela. And that's clearly what the Conservatives will and must argue. On the substance, I think there are probably two distinct points. First, Britain is an economy deeply embedded in the world economy. We are very dependent on foreign direct investment in a whole slew of fields, which means foreign decision making, and the city is itself an important example of that. There are hundreds of foreign banks here, and London is one of the world's two most important financial centres. It's not just that he's attacking the city, which is itself a very important revenue and a very, very important part of our economy. He's, of course, indirectly going to frighten, I think, without any doubt, a very large number of companies that come in the belief that we're an open, pro-business, pro-market, internationally entwined economy. So that's very dangerous. On the banks themselves, there is, I think, still a reasonable debate to be had about the future of British banking. I think the banking sector we ended up with after the crisis, and indeed brought us into the crisis, still has some pretty big problems. And the most important, I think, are that it is too concentrated and it doesn't serve the real economy very well. If he focused on those things with targeted intelligent thoughts about how to remedy those things, I actually think it would be quite a good thing. But of course, that would be much too subtle. It wouldn't be very populist, and it probably wouldn't get him where he wants. But the complaint that banking isn't working as well as we would like, that's not an unreasonable complaint, and many people outside the Labour left circle would agree with it.
Martin, of course, is quite right that the broader message from the Corbynite belief system is to do with not actually wanting a particularly open economy, because what we might describe as open to the Corbyn wing of the Labour Party is this cursed thing, neoliberal. Neoliberal is, of course, a phrase which 5 years ago was only used on the fringes of British politics and is now the kind of insult du jour. So, in fact, this whole worldview that Martin's describing as so worrying, so scary to business, is of course the genuinely held belief system of Corbyn and those around him. When you're talking about a Labour Party that wants to win a general election, should one come sooner rather than later, that's not enough, of course, because they've got to win over the doubters. And it's very interesting to see Corbyn making this initiative this week, when, of course, John McDonnell, his shadow chancellor, has actually been extremely careful, even during the Labour Party conference where he was talking to the party faithful, to sound as reasonable and as social democratic as he possibly could in the circumstances. So those are kind of competing rhetorical threads there, that they haven't resolved that.
And it does sort of fly in the face of all this work Mr McDonnell has been doing to appeal to the City of London. And he was saying during party conference he's been hitting up the chai tea circuit, where he's been going around financiers, hedge funds and what have you, to explain to them why a Labour government won't be so radical. It's not going to completely overturn our economic model, just a bit more spending here. It's actually much more Scandinavian. That's the line they love to put out there. But then you see this kind of rhetoric and it does seem entirely in the face of that, Martin.
Well, his problem, I suspect, is I don't know what they would do in power. I suspect they don't know what they will do about. Put that aside. But they have two groups, very different groups of people they want to satisfy. They have brought into the Labour Party a whole huge number of enthusiastic, many young people who want the radical message. They want the rejection of what Miranda calls neoliberalism, the word they use. At the same time, to win a general election, he has to get out of that ghetto, because clearly he's going to have to win somewhere in the 46% of the electorate, given how close it was last time. And these are people who will be very disturbed, I think, but maybe I'm wrong, about the rhetoric that might, when we've got Brexit anyway, chase more businesses out of the country, lose more revenue from the city. It's a very big revenue earner, make it more difficult to fund the NHS and all the other essential things. Now, we've had a whole bunch of, let's put it gently, fibs on that subject from the Tory right, the Brexiters, and now maybe we have a whole new set of fibs. And so how Labour will manage to address these two fundamentally different audiences, I don't know. But they've got one thing on their side, which is that really the Conservatives cannot now get up and say, we are at least the competent party. You can rely on us to look after things well. That's sort of gone. And so Corbyn has a chance.
This is the extraordinary thing, Miranda, because the Conservatives have always been the party of business, of enterprise and of the City of London, but we really don't hear anything from them about that. And the City Minister, a chap called Stephen Barclay, I don't think either of you will be able to tell me a single thing about him or see him in an interview or tell me what his views on the City of London are. And I think at this crucial time, particularly with Brexit, there's this sense from the Conservatives that the city is a bit of a headache because it flies in the face of this populist unrest that has been unlocked by our departure from the EU. And as Martin said, the economic uncertainty ahead will be blamed on the Tories if we end up getting pulled into a recession.
Absolutely, and that is the factor which could, in the end, post-Brexit, restructure British politics, I think. The fact that the Conservative Party has kind of resiled from its role as the party of business. And there is a huge opportunity there for the opposition, who, as we've said, are, on the other hand, pulled in different directions. I think we should also just notice that this Corbyn tirade against investment bankers does also come at quite a convenient time for them in another sense, which is that it distracts from Labour's mess over Brexit itself. It's got a very uneasy compromise on the main issue of the day, and so erecting this hate figure of the city, whether it's a straw man or not in this case, is very convenient for them. Also, the only other headlines about the Labour Party in recent days have been about this momentumite purge of councillors and of lower-ranking elected representatives of the Labour Party, which it's thought is actually the much cleverer way of dominating the party in the future than going for the MPs first. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of the Corbynite power grab of the party, and to have a headline that's him attacking figures who most of the country are suspicious of anyway in terms of their role is pretty convenient this week.
And it's actually quite a good attack, because Jeremy Corbyn's on the cover of GQ magazine, which has unravelled as well, and the editor of GQ, Dylan Jones, has described Mr Corbyn as being pushed around by his aides like a grandpa, which is a very unfortunate headline for them to get out of this interview. But this one actually seems to be very well done, and not least because of how it was put across on social media, that they had a very well thing. They'd gone through all the donors to the Conservative Party and said all these people are actually Tories, they're trying to score political points, and here's our nice little friendly Mr Corbyn sticking up for the ordinary man. And of course it's working class voters who they really do need to bring on side if they're going to win a majority come the next election.
Yes, and I think the thing is, we've got to accept that as the three of us sit here in this room and talk about the real role of the City of London and the real nature of the British economy as an open, globalised thing, making those arguments has become so hard, and the Brexit referendum demonstrated this. I mean, we could try, for example, to go out and explain why the tax take from all these bankers is so valuable to the rest of us, why it pays for the NHS and schools, etc. But that argument is going to come up with the same problems that the Remain argument came up against in the Brexit referendum. Yep. And you have got a public mood which is resolutely sort of anti-elite. And so any of these rhetorical flourishes which hit, so-called fat cat pay, etc., they're just going to go over at the moment. And it may be that those people who are scared by the broader Corbynite worldview that it exposes are actually outweighed by the people who feel sympathetic to that message.
Well, it's where I started. Project Fear might not work, and it might well mean that Mr Corbyn will be elected, but I'd underline what Seb said, which is both of our main parties on the Brexit issue are deeply internally divided, and neither, in fact, if you look at it carefully, has a coherent policy on the economy. The rest of the world has noticed this, and they have concluded that Britain is in pretty serious disarray, and that's what Morgan Stanley was saying.
And just very finally, briefly, Martin, do you think Morgan Stanley were actually right in saying Mr Corbyn is a bigger threat than a hard Brexit?
It is perfectly possible to imagine that a seriously incompetent and extreme Labour government, I'm not saying that will happen, can do simply stupendous damage. We've seen this we haven't seen this in Europe since the war, but we've seen it in countries in Latin America, for example, Argentina, Venezuela, that sort of Peru at one point, that sort of completely irresponsible populist left-wing economics is fantastically destructive. It doesn't work. I've written a column about it. It's consistent. Now, the Swedish model works beautifully, but the Swedish model is seriously disciplined. It's an open economy and always has been, and they understand how to get these priorities right. I think the Corbyn lot haven't decided whether they're essentially anti-American, Latin American type populists or serious social democrats, and that's why this government would worry me. But on the other hand, I have to say I'm fantastically unimpressed by the Conservatives, so at the moment I regard myself as aggressively independent.